Power is the oldest weapon in human history, older than language, older than the idea of justice. It hides behind uniforms, titles, and flags. It whispers through orders that sound like duty but feel like domination. When people are stripped of dignity, of clothes, of voice, what's being tested is not just their endurance, but the reach of power itself. In every war, in every prison, in every secret room where fear has a face, power has always been measured by how far someone can go in humiliating another human being and still call it order. Humiliation isn't random. It's crafted. It's a message. When the soldiers dragged her forward, when they made her stand beneath the hard light, it wasn't just about breaking her body. It was about showing everyone else what happens when you resist. Power performs. It needs witnesses. It thrives in the eyes of the terrified. Every jeer, every order to look away, every forced laugh builds the illusion that authority is unshakable. That illusion is the fuel. Without it, fear loses its shape. They stripped her not because they needed to. They did it because humiliation erases identity faster than pain. Pain ends, shame lingers. The act becomes a kind of ritual, a ceremony of dominance dressed in the language of discipline. Every gesture says, "You are nothing. You are ours to expose." It's a script played out countless times in the shadows of history, always with the same cruel rhythm, one side commanding, the other stripped of everything but breath. But power, when it feeds on humiliation, always overreaches. It mistakes silence for submission. It confuses nakedness with defeat. What those men didn't understand was that every time they stripped someone, they were revealing more of themselves than their victim. The ugliness of their intent hung heavy in the air, impossible to disguise beneath the pretense of authority. The room becomes a mirror, and power, once so sure of itself, begins to look grotesque in its own reflection. When the commander gave the order, it was routine to him. He had done this before, turned human beings into objects, convinced himself it was procedure. That's the trick of power. It dulls empathy. It makes cruelty look efficient. And when cruelty becomes a habit, the human cost disappears behind the structure of command. The men follow orders, the commander feels nothing, and the system keeps feeding itself, layer after layer of obedience built on fear. But in that moment, something shifted. Power relies on certainty. It needs to believe it knows everything about the person it is crushing. That's what makes humiliation so central. It's the illusion that there's nothing left to hide. When they stripped her, they believed they were exposing everything. But power never imagines that the act of exposure might reveal something it didn't expect. That's why the commander froze. Because power, so sure of its dominance, never prepares for recognition. That tattoo wasn't supposed to exist in his world of control and order. It broke through the performance. It reminded him that even the humiliated can carry secrets that rewrite the scene. For a split second, the hierarchy cracked. The soldiers saw him hesitate. They saw the fear flicker behind his eyes. And in that hesitation, the entire illusion of control faltered. Humiliation as a tool only works when the victim remains faceless. The moment identity breaks through a word, a mark, a memory, power loses its absolute hold. It becomes exposed. The commander's authority had always been built on the certainty that those beneath him were interchangeable, disposable. But that tattoo made her specific, real, not a symbol of weakness, but of connection, of something that stretched beyond his command. In that space of shock, the nature of power changed shape. It was no longer a monologue. It became a confrontation. The room that had once echoed with laughter and control turned quiet, thick with something unspoken. Everyone could feel it, the strange reversal that happens when power is forced to see the humanity it tried to erase. Power without empathy collapses into paranoia. The commander's silence wasn't mercy. It was fear of what he suddenly understood. That domination, when pushed to the edge, doesn't guarantee control. It reveals how fragile control really is. The soldiers looked to him for direction, but he had none. The script had been broken, the performance disrupted. Power, which had seemed absolute just moments before, now trembled under the weight of its own exposure. That's what humiliation can't predict, the moment when its own violence backfires. When the act meant to erase someone ends up revealing the limits of domination itself. Power can destroy bodies, but it cannot erase the truth that hides beneath the skin. A tattoo is more than ink on skin. It's a choice that lives where words can't reach, a language written in pain and permanence. The soldiers didn't see that when they dragged her forward. To them, it was decoration, irrelevant, meaningless. They were too used to seeing bodies as objects, too certain that nothing on a prisoner's skin could matter. But a symbol, no matter how small, can shatter that blindness. A symbol carries memory, defiance, history. And when power meets something it can't interpret, it begins to hesitate. The tattoo on her spine wasn't loud. It didn't scream rebellion. It whispered something deeper, something that only those who had seen what she'd seen could understand. It wasn't just a mark. It was a code, a piece of identity smuggled past humiliation. It existed in the one place they couldn't take away, her skin. To the ones who tore at her clothes, it was supposed to be the final act of domination. But the moment that ink surfaced under the harsh light, everything changed. The symbol became a mirror, and suddenly they were the ones exposed. Symbols have always terrified those who depend on control. A uniform is a symbol. A flag is a symbol. So is a tattoo. They work in opposite directions, one imposed from above, one chosen from within. The commander wore his authority on his shoulders, visible in the badges and medal that told everyone who he was supposed to be. She carried hers on her back, invisible until that moment, quiet until it was forced into the open. His symbols demanded obedience. Hers demanded recognition. The clash between those two languages is where power begins to fracture. A tattoo doesn't ask permission to exist. It tells a story whether someone wants to hear it or not. It's a rebellion that breathes through the skin. For her, that ink might have been a name, a promise, a belief, something sacred she refused to let die. It could have been the mark of a movement, a resistance, or a memory of someone lost. The meaning didn't matter as much as the fact that it meant something, and that meaning was hers alone. In a place where every part of her life had been taken, this one thing remained untouchable. When the commander saw it, he froze not because he understood immediately, but because he recognized. Recognition is the enemy of dominance. It connects the oppressor to the oppressed in a way that power tries to avoid. Maybe he'd seen that symbol before, in a forbidden file, on a poster he'd ordered to be destroyed, on the body of someone he once feared. Whatever it was, it broke through the armor of command. His authority was built on distance, on the ability to act without seeing individuals. But now he was looking at something that forced him to see. The tattoo became more than a mark. It became a question, hanging in the air, demanding an answer he didn't have. What did it mean that this woman, stripped and shamed before him, carried something powerful enough to make him stop? What did it mean that in a room full of uniforms and weapons, a single curve of ink could shift the balance? Power hates questions it can't answer. It survives on clarity, on the illusion that every action has a justification. The tattoo didn't fit that script. It was too human, too alive. The soldiers felt it too. They didn't understand, but they saw the commander's hesitation. In his pause, their confidence faltered. That's how symbols work. They ripple through the air, rearranging the invisible order of things. A second earlier, they were in control. Now, they were uncertain. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was confusion mixed with fear. They'd been trained to read power in body language, in certainty, in the tone of command. But the commander's stillness broke that rhythm. Authority began to dissolve, one breath at a time. The tattoo's power came from contrast. Against bruised skin, against fear, against exposure, it stood as something chosen. Power operates by stripping choice away, but the tattoo was proof that she once chose something freely, and that choice survived everything they had done to her. It was evidence of will, of intention, of belief. In a system that depends on erasing the self, that tiny mark declared that she still owned part of herself. The commander saw it not just as a symbol, but as a threat. Because symbols that come from the people, not from the regime, have always been dangerous. They spread quietly, carried on whispers, on stories, on bodies. They don't need armies to survive. They live through memory. The tattoo made her body a message, and the message was already out of his control. He could order silence, but he couldn't erase what everyone had just seen. The power dynamic was already shifting beneath his feet, invisible but irreversible. That moment revealed the truth about symbols. They are most powerful when they are least understood. The commander's fear wasn't about the design itself. It was about what it might stand for, who it might connect her to, what it might awaken in others. Power depends on predictable meanings, on a world where everything can be categorized and contained. The tattoo refused to be contained. It existed outside his system, outside his comprehension. That's what made it dangerous. The soldiers still stood there, waiting for his next command, but the room was no longer his. The symbol had stolen their attention, rewritten the scene, and turned humiliation into revelation. It was no longer about the woman they stripped. It was about the secret she carried in plain sight. The commander's hesitation was the kind that changes a room. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible, but everyone felt it. Power rarely collapses with a shout. It unravels in silence. When he froze, when his hand stopped midair and his voice faltered, the atmosphere shifted from routine cruelty to something uncertain and human. The soldiers didn't understand why. They looked at him, waiting for the next command, but it never came. The air was thick, the kind that makes every sound feel like an intrusion. What they were seeing wasn't indecision, it was recognition, and recognition can be deadly to authority. He had seen that tattoo before. Not just once, not in passing. It belonged to something or someone that the regime had buried deep in its forbidden archives. It was a mark associated with loyalty, loyalty to an idea that had been outlawed, erased from speeches and textbooks, treated as myth. Seeing it now, on the back of a prisoner stripped and humiliated by his own men, was like seeing a ghost from a war he thought was over. The mark was supposed to be extinct, and yet there it was, alive, breathing, staring back at him from her skin without saying a word. His authority depended on certainty. Every order he gave, every punishment he delivered, came from a place where he could not afford to feel. Command is built on distance. You give orders, they are obeyed, and the machine keeps moving. But recognition destroys distance. It collapses the space between oppressor and victim. It turns the abstract into the personal. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at an enemy. He was looking at someone who carried a memory of him, his past, or his failures. His soldiers could not see it, but the look in his eyes betrayed it. Something had cracked. In that crack, fear entered. Not the kind of fear that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from truth. The truth that the line between power and guilt is thinner than he wanted to believe. The tattoo was proof of something he had buried long ago. Maybe a secret allegiance, maybe an old betrayal, maybe a promise broken in the name of survival. It reminded him of what he had become, of the things he'd chosen to forget to keep climbing the chain of command. Every symbol carries a story, and this one spoke a language he couldn't silence. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They were used to his confidence, to the steady rhythm of his cruelty. Now they saw him hesitate, and hesitation in a commander is a dangerous thing. It spreads like static. It confuses the ranks. The silence grew heavy. They didn't dare move, but their eyes betrayed their unease. They were seeing power blink, and that was something no soldier should ever witness. The pause lasted seconds, but it felt like a rupture. Inside him, a memory surfaced, the face of someone from before the uniform, before the orders. Maybe it was a sister, a lover, a friend, someone who wore the same mark. The tattoo's lines, sharp and deliberate, traced an old allegiance he once shared or betrayed. That recognition was unbearable. It blurred the boundaries that had kept him safe in his role. He was supposed to be the enforcer, the unshakable hand of the state. But now, the past was staring back at him from a woman's skin, reminding him that power doesn't erase history. It only hides it until the right moment. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The symbol seemed to pulse under the light, alive with accusation. He realized his men were watching him, waiting for direction, and that realization trapped him. If he reacted, if he punished her, he would expose the fear he felt. If he let her go, he would expose weakness. Power exists in the illusion of control, and for the first time, he no longer knew which choice would keep that illusion intact. His fingers twitched, but no words came out. The soldiers glanced at each other, unsure. They were trained to read tone, posture, eyes, all the cues of authority. What they saw now was contradiction. Their commander, the man who had ordered executions without blinking, stood frozen before a prisoner who hadn't said a single word. The silence grew louder with every second. It was no longer obedience that held them still, it was confusion. The chain of command had bent, just slightly, but enough for everyone to feel it. The commander's mind was racing. The mark on her back wasn't just a threat to him personally. It was a threat to the entire structure he represented. If that symbol still existed, then so did the people behind it. It meant resistance hadn't been crushed completely. It meant lies had been told, reports falsified, victories exaggerated. The tattoo was a reminder that no regime erases everything. Something always survives, even if it's hidden beneath the skin of one person. He realized that humiliation had backfired. What was meant to strip her power had revealed his vulnerability instead. The room was still full of his soldiers, his weapons, his authority, yet none of it felt solid anymore. Every eye in that room saw him hesitate, and that hesitation would live in their memories longer than any order he could give. It would spread in whispers, retold in barracks and corridors, that moment when their commander froze because a prisoner's tattoo made him remember something he shouldn't have. The commander stood still, jaw locked, trying to summon the voice that always came so easily. But words were useless now. He couldn't order the past away. He couldn't erase what he'd seen. The tattoo had already done its work. It had reminded him that no system of control is complete, that there are cracks even in the walls built by fear. They tried to take everything from her. The clothes, the dignity, the sense of being human. Humiliation was their language, control their religion. But identity doesn't vanish under force. It hides, it waits, it survives in corners that power can't reach. When they stripped her, they thought they were erasing her. They didn't understand that identity isn't something you wear. It's something you carry inside the bones. Every act meant to destroy her only pressed her closer to the truth of who she was. That tattoo on her spine wasn't decoration. It was proof. Proof that even when the body is violated, the self can refuse to die. She stood there, exposed under the harsh light, skin marked by violence and survival. Yet something in her posture didn't break. Shame was supposed to make her small, supposed to fold her into silence. Instead, the silence around her grew into something different, defiance without words. They saw a prisoner. She felt something else. She felt the weight of her ancestors, her people, the forgotten names that the regime had tried to erase. Each one of them lived inside that ink. She wasn't alone, not even in that room full of men who thought they had the power to decide who she was allowed to be. Identity reclaimed itself in the smallest gestures, in the way she refused to look down, in the stillness of her breathing, measured, deliberate. The commander's voice had once been the law, but when he froze, the balance shifted. His silence was her mirror. In his hesitation, she saw the crack in the machine that had crushed so many. Power depends on erasure, but identity depends on memory, and memory doesn't ask permission. It exists stubbornly, like light creeping through broken walls. Every humiliation she endured became a test of what could not be taken. They thought nakedness was the end of resistance. But nakedness, in that moment, became armor. They had stripped away everything external, leaving only the truth. And the truth was stronger than the lie they built around her. When the commander's eyes locked on the tattoo, she knew the world had shifted. The mark they tried to shame her for became the center of the story. Her skin told a history they couldn't rewrite. For years, the regime had taught them to believe that individuality was weakness, that the collective mattered more than the self, that obedience was virtue. But here was the living contradiction to that ideology, a woman whose body carried a symbol of choice. She was supposed to be silent, nameless, one of thousands. Yet she had dared to carry something personal, permanent, untouchable. That act alone was rebellion. Reclaiming identity in a world built on submission is the purest form of defiance. The commander's fear revealed what power always tries to hide, that authority is fragile when faced with authenticity. His uniform was a mask, his voice an echo of orders written by others. Her mark, though small, was real. It came from pain, from belief, from a moment of decision that no one could undo. In that confrontation, she regained something far greater than dignity. She regained ownership of her own story. Power can take control of the narrative, but it can't rewrite the truth written on a person's body, on their memory, on their will to remain themselves. The soldiers around her didn't understand what they were witnessing. They saw hesitation as confusion, not transformation. But she felt it, the quiet reclamation happening inside her. For the first time since her capture, she wasn't reacting. She was becoming. Every breath reminded her that she had survived everything they'd done so far. The tattoo on her spine wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a declaration. The body they thought they owned was a battlefield, and she had just won the ground of her own identity back. The irony was brutal. They had tried to expose her to destroy her, yet the exposure revealed them instead, their fear, their fragility, their dependence on control. She realized then that humiliation isn't a loss of power when you refuse to accept the meaning imposed on it. They wanted her to feel broken. But brokenness isn't the absence of strength. Sometimes it's the shape strength takes after survival. The cracks become definitions. The scars become sentences. The mark on her back became punctuation in a story they didn't expect her to tell. Her identity wasn't the kind they could categorize. It wasn't national or tribal or ideological. It was personal, human, alive. The tattoo connected her to a memory larger than any flag, larger than the uniformed men in the room. It was a language older than authority, written in endurance and belief. The moment the commander recognized it, he unknowingly acknowledged her humanity. And that acknowledgement was enough. Recognition is dangerous to those who depend on dehumanization. It means the story isn't over, the victim isn't erased, and the system isn't complete. Every second that passed reinforced her presence. They couldn't make her invisible anymore. Their silence was her victory. The tattoo on her spine glowed faintly under the light, each line of ink standing as testimony. They had stripped her body bare, but in doing so, they had revealed the truth they feared most, that identity, once chosen, cannot be taken away. Silence is not emptiness. It is a language that power doesn't know how to read. When the laughter stopped, when the shouts died down, when the commander froze, the room filled with something heavier than noise. The soldiers shifted their weight, uneasy, waiting for a cue that never came. The silence was thick, stretching across the air like a curtain between what had been done and what could never be undone. It wasn't just quiet, it was exposure. It revealed guilt in ways words never could. The commander had lived his life surrounded by sound. Orders barked, boots pounding, weapons loading, prisoners screaming. Noise was the soundtrack of control. It covered doubt, masked hesitation, filled the gaps where conscience might have spoken. But now the noise was gone, stripped away by one mark on one woman's spine. The silence that followed wasn't mercy, it was judgment. It turned every man in that room into a witness. Power thrives on momentum, on movement, but silence stops everything. It forces people to hear themselves breathe. It forces them to feel the weight of their own actions. The commander's eyes lingered on the tattoo, and in that stillness, the sound of guilt began to hum beneath his ribs. He could feel it, the memory of every order he had given that led to rooms like this, to women like her, to cruelty justified as necessity. Silence turned those memories into mirrors. He saw himself reflected in her, the very thing he had trained himself not to do. In that instant, the system that had defined him cracked. He wasn't just the commander anymore. He was a man standing before the truth of what he had done. The soldiers didn't move. They watched him, and in their watching, they understood something had changed. No one needed to say it. The quiet carried its own command, one that no one dared to follow. Even their breathing felt too loud. They were taught that silence was weakness, that obedience required constant affirmation through sound, through action. But this silence felt like power, and it didn't belong to them. It belonged to her. The woman they had stripped now owned the air they stood in. Her stillness had replaced their authority. Silence does that. It inverts the order. It gives weight to the one who has been denied a voice. Every second without words became a form of speech. Her body, still and unbroken, spoke louder than any plea could have. It told them that what they had done was seen, that it would be remembered, that their power had limits. The commander's inability to speak became its own confession. The soldiers didn't need him to admit guilt aloud. His silence was enough. It said everything words could not: hesitation, fear, recognition, shame. The woman didn't need to scream. The absence of sound was her revenge. Every act of violence depends on noise to sustain it. The shouting, the justifications, the chaos. Quiet dismantles it. In silence, there is no distraction, no excuse. Just the raw truth of what remains after the cruelty ends. The soldiers began to realize they were standing inside a scene that would haunt them. They were not the victors they had imagined themselves to be. They were participants in something shameful, something that no one would dare to speak about later. Silence was the witness that couldn't be erased. The commander tried to regain control. He cleared his throat, tried to form words, but his voice cracked before it left his lips. The silence swallowed it. The room didn't obey him anymore. His power had depended on sound, on being heard, on commanding attention. Without it, he was just a man surrounded by the echo of what he'd lost. His authority dissolved, not through rebellion or resistance, but through the unbearable stillness that exposed his fear. In that stillness, the truth began to surface. The truth that power hides behind noise, that cruelty disguises itself in commands, that obedience survives because people are too afraid to listen to what silence reveals. Now they were listening. The hum of a flickering light, the shuffle of boots, the ragged sound of someone breathing. It was all that remained. The noise of domination had been replaced by the sound of consequence. The soldiers looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with unease. They saw that she hadn't been defeated. The silence had turned her into something untouchable. The humiliation they thought they'd inflicted had transformed into reflection, and that reflection pointed at them. They felt naked in their uniforms, exposed not by force, but by awareness. Guilt doesn't always scream. It lingers quietly, like smoke after fire. The commander's thoughts spiraled. He wanted to speak, to reassert control, to remind them who he was. But every word that formed in his mind tasted hollow. The silence had already told the story, and anything he said would only confirm it. He understood, maybe for the first time, that silence doesn't forgive. It remembers. It lingers. It waits. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears, loud and uneven. The noise he once used to dominate others was gone, replaced by the weight of knowing that everyone in that room had seen the truth. The woman didn't move. She didn't look away. Her stillness was complete, her silence deliberate. She had no weapon, no allies, no freedom. But in that moment, she held all the power that mattered. The commander could feel it pressing down on him. The realization that the louder a system tries to shout its control, the more easily it can be undone by silence. The moment the commander froze, the air in the room changed. The soldiers felt it before they understood it. Something invisible had shifted, the sense of direction, the certainty of control, the balance between victim and ruler. What had begun as humiliation was turning into something unplanned, something dangerous. The silence, the tattoo, the hesitation, all of it combined into a single, fragile moment where power began to lose its shape. What had been a spectacle of dominance now felt like a reckoning. She was supposed to be powerless, but suddenly she was the one everyone looked at. The commander had built his career on control. Every command obeyed, every punishment executed, every display of authority reinforced his belief that power flowed only one way. But that day it reversed. The woman who stood before him had no weapon, no rank, no voice, yet she forced him to see himself without his uniform. When he looked at the tattoo, he saw not rebellion, but reflection. For the first time, he realized that fear and guilt could exist on his side of the equation too. The hierarchy he had relied on to define right and wrong no longer made sense. The soldiers waited for him to act, but his silence said everything. The power they once believed was unshakable now trembled before their eyes. They saw him hesitate, and in that hesitation, they began to question. If their leader could be silenced by one mark on a woman's back, then maybe the stories they'd been told, the certainty of victory, the righteousness of cruelty, were lies. They had been told that strength came from control, but what they saw now was that true power could exist even in submission. It could exist in standing still, in refusing to break. She felt it too. The eyes that had watched her as an object of shame now carried something else. Uncertainty, confusion, maybe even respect. She didn't need to speak. Her stillness was enough. Every breath she took became an act of defiance. What they thought was her lowest point was becoming her rise. In the strange, suspended quiet, she reclaimed the meaning of her body, her mark, her existence. The commander's fear had given her strength. Power had turned inward and exposed its weakness, and she stood at the center of that revelation without saying a word. Moral victory doesn't arrive with triumph or applause. It arrives in the moment when truth stands unmasked and refuses to move. The tattoo was her truth, and now it had turned into theirs. The commander could no longer pretend ignorance. He had seen something he couldn't unsee, felt something he couldn't control. Every soldier in that room had witnessed his break, and that break would echo. It would follow them into the nights when orders came down, when cruelty was commanded again. They would remember this moment, the image of their leader's fear before the strength of someone they had tried to destroy. She didn't plan for any of this. She wasn't seeking revenge, wasn't trying to make a statement. She was surviving, and survival itself had become resistance. The victory wasn't about defeating the commander. It was about undoing the meaning of defeat. They had taken her clothes, her freedom, her safety, but not her essence. That mark on her spine was more than ink. It was proof that even in a world built to crush the human spirit, the spirit adapts. It finds ways to speak through silence, through symbols, through endurance. The commander's authority, so carefully built on fear, began to dissolve under the weight of what he felt. His men were still, waiting for him to regain control, but he couldn't. The power dynamic he relied on had turned into quicksand. The more he tried to stand firm, the deeper he sank into the realization of his own vulnerability. His face betrayed him. His fear was visible now, and once seen, it could not be unseen. His soldiers didn't move, but they understood something fundamental had changed. He was no longer untouchable. What he faced wasn't rebellion in the usual sense. It was the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't scream or fight, but simply refuses to yield. Her body, her stillness, her mark, all of it declared that she belonged to herself, not to them. The act meant to erase her identity had only clarified it. The commander's hesitation was the moment of defeat, not hers. Power depends on belief, and belief had just shifted sides. The soldier's eyes darted between the commander and the woman. No one spoke. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was alive, full of realization. They were witnesses to something rare, the undoing of authority from within. The humiliation had flipped, becoming a mirror that reflected the guilt of those who inflicted it. Every second stretched longer, carrying the weight of what had just occurred. The woman had no army, but she had conquered the one thing that sustained theirs, certainty. When she straightened her back slightly, it wasn't arrogance, it was reclamation. The movement was small, but it rippled through the room. For the first time, she wasn't the one under their control. The soldiers looked away, unable to hold her gaze. The commander remained frozen, trapped in the realization that he had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. She had taken nothing from him, yet he had lost everything that made him powerful. The victory was invisible but complete. It didn't free her body, but it freed her soul. It didn't change the structure of command, but it shattered its illusion. Power had shown its weakness, and she had stood through it without flinching. The moral balance had shifted forever, and everyone in that room knew it, even if none of them dared to say it aloud.